On July 14, 2016, the Utah Court of Appeals issued its decision in the case of In re E.M.J. A link to that decision is provided here as well as in the description section of this video report. The father appealed the juvenile court's termination of his parental rights in the minor child, whose initials were used in the decision E.M.J. The Court of Appeals affirmed the juvenile court's decision. At the trial, the state asserted that father had abandoned E.M.J. by failing to communicate with him for more than 6 months. Father responded that he stopped contacting E.M.J. only because he was misinformed as to his visitation rights. The juvenile court determined that the state had made a prima facie showing of abandonment and that father's evidence had failed to overcome that showing. The court further determined that termination was in E.M.J.'s best interests and terminated father's parental rights. Father appealed, asserting that the juvenile court employed the wrong procedural framework and standard of proof in evaluating whether he abandoned E.M.J. The Court of Appeals was sympathetic to father's position that he misunderstood his visitation rights and that the discretion granted to the therapist to schedule visitation may have barred him from seeing E.M.J. even in the absence of a court order. Although the court did find that it was unreasonable for father to rely on the false representations of the therapist and foster mother in establishing his belief that he was barred from visiting E.M.J., the court's decision relied primarily on its determination that father's actions, even in light of that belief, were inconsistent with those of a dedicated parent. The court was not convinced that the juvenile court's determination that father consciously disregarded his parental obligations to the destruction of the parent-child relationship was against the clear weight of the evidence. Previous appellate decisions have indicated that even when a parent is barred from contact with his children by means of a protective order, his lack of effort toward restoring his visitation rights, his failure to provide support for the children in the interim, and his failure to take advantage of opportunities to visit the children demonstrate a conscious disregard for parental obligations. Nothing in the juvenile court's order placed an undue burden on father or misapplied the framework outlined by our Supreme Court. Finally, father argued that the evidence was insufficient to support the juvenile court's determination that it was in E.M.J.'s best interest that father's parental rights be terminated. Father's argument relied primarily on his assertion that the court's best interests finding was based, quote, solely on testimony from, unquote, the foster mother, and the foster mother's credibility is of concern. But credibility is a question for the juvenile court, and father failed to show that the juvenile court's reliance on the foster mother's testimony was an abuse of its discretion. Father failed to establish that the evidence was insufficient to support the juvenile court's finding that termination of his parental rights was in E.M.J.'s best interests.